So here is this giant of a man, the monster warrior. And in verses 8, 9, and 10, for 3 verses, we have to endure his blasphemous boasting and his rhetoric. I mean, just listen to his arrogant boasting as he speaks with the voice of a bullhorn. And according to verse 8, Goliath bellows, "Why do you come to set your battle in array?" In other words, there's no need for 2 whole armies to fight. Let's just do it this way. Our side will have a man, and I'll be that man. And I have a feeling he was thinking of King Saul for the other side, because King Saul was a pretty big guy, muscular man. And Goliath said, "Just let the 2 of us warriors duke it out, and the one who wins, winner take all." What an absolutely frightening scene. And the Israelite warriors were scared out of their wits. And I can almost see Goliath there in verse 10 as he lifts those big hands of his, the size of ham hocks, to heaven and cries, "I defy the armies of Jehovah this day." And it must have absolutely struck sheer terror into the hearts of those soldiers of the Israeli army. You know, this is a good lesson for all of us. Because all of us face our giants in life. Now, your giant is different than my giant. But each of us has our own big, bad giant to face. And all of us has our encounter with them in different sizes and strengths. Maybe the giant that's running your life is emotional. It's your constant fear and your constant worry and your constant anxiety. And what if this or what if that happens? Maybe you have no faith in God to protect you or to watch over you or your family or your loved ones, and all you do is worry and worry. Maybe that's your giant that's making you depressed and robbing your peace and making your life miserable. Maybe your giant is jealousy or prejudice. Because sometimes that giant that we have is an inability to get along with other people. Maybe it's a problem on the job. Or maybe it's something that's going on at home. But it is a giant, and it looms in front of you, and it interferes with everything you want to do. Maybe it's some kind of handicap or a phobia. Or a hang-up that you have that's just paralyzing you. Maybe that's your Goliath. That giant thing in your life that keeps you from God's will. That giant thing that every time you pray and you want to go out and do something for God, that's the thing that always keeps you from doing it. That's the giant thing in your life that taunts you and humiliates you and demoralizes you and fills you with hopeless despair that you'll never get out of this valley alive. And that day in the valley of Elah, those Israelite soldiers were not only impressed, they were depressed by this huge giant. But at the height of their depression, God sends someone to save them. Amen. Now, who would they expect God to send? Who would they welcome? Well, he would have to be a man at least 10 feet tall. He'd have to be a warrior, a trained warrior, and he would have to have a sophisticated army and a very skilled warrior. But who did God send? A little 16-year-old boy with a slingshot and a rock, clothed in a shepherd's robe with no military training. Gee! When a job needs to be done, God doesn't come down and ask our opinion. Amen. Have you found that to be true? Amen. And he doesn't come down and ask our permission. Amen. And he doesn't take a vote. Amen. He simply sends the one he knows is the one needed to get the job done. Amen. And he often sends the exact opposite of what we think he should. And that brings us to point number 2. David's confession. Verse 12, little David steps on the scene. Now keep in mind that David was the 8th son of Jesse, who was a well-known man in the days of King Saul. And Jesse was a highly respected man in Saul's kingdom. 3 of Jesse's boys were serving in Saul's army. And they were now on the front lines of the battlefield. And in verse 13, we are told their names, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. Now, you remember Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. These 3 sons were the very ones that God bypassed. These were the 3 sons that God had rejected and specifically said in chapter 16 that we studied last week that they were not to be the future kings of Israel. None of them had God chosen. Okay, now they are in the battle on the front lines down in the valley of Elah, and they are being mocked and degraded, denigrated, ridiculed, humiliated daily by this big lug called Goliath. But Jesse's youngest boy, little David, is still back with the sheep playing his harp and writing songs. As it says there in verse 15, but David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep in Bethlehem. So by this time, David was also working part-time as King Saul's harpist. So obviously, David was an excellent musician, very skilled, accomplished at the harp. And since King Saul was living a life of disobedience, the Spirit of God could no longer protect him from the forces of evil. I know the Bible says an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul. But you must understand that that just means that when a person lives in sinful rebellion against God, God's Spirit can no longer protect that person from the evil one. And Satan is allowed to then have full sway with that person. And when the evil spirits would torment King Saul, they would call in David to play sacred music that caused the demons to flee and calm King Saul's soul. And David's holy presence and his inspiring music helped Saul deal with the demons of misery that were tormenting his mind and his heart. Amen. So David is obviously not on call at the palace at this time because King Saul was away at battle. So David has gone back to tending his father's sheep, and it says there in verse 16, and the Philistine, meaning Goliath, drew near morning and evening and presented himself for 40 days. So twice a day, morning and evening, for 40 long days, Goliath had come out and taunted and laughed and challenged their manhood, humiliated their masculinity, cursed their mothers, called their sisters prostitutes, blasphemed their God, and he demands that they send him a man, any man, but he taunts them that they can't do it because they are all a bunch of limp-wristed homosexual cowards. And every man in this room knows that that is exactly what Goliath was doing.